Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday morning. I hope everybody's doing well. And there's so much to catch up on over the last couple of weeks and days. What's happening in the war on Gaza? There's so much going on within Gaza and outside. Internationally, countries are trying to. I like this terminology, brother Ismail. I really want you to touch on this. The fact that it's not what do you call it again? A ceasefire, a truce. They want to have truce talks, and I like these different words and how they, phrase it, so it comes across that one side is actually not willing to give up. It's like a truce. And of course, on one side, Israel won't look bad and Hamas won't look bad. But in reality, Israel is damned, And you can see it throughout the protests which are taking across around the world with people, people at universities in America. It's all over the news right now. Where is this freedom of speech? Where is the freedom of expressing yourself? Where is the freedom of want to be a cat? Where is the freedom of you want to describe yourself as a dog? Where is this entitlement gone when it comes to the Palestinians and the Gaza situation? It is a total disgrace. It's a shambles. And I'm really annoyed by some of this. I'm sorry, but some of this BS. It really has to stop and it has to be addressed. And alhamdulillah, we've got Brother Yusuf Ismail all the way from South Africa. Thank you, Brother Yusuf Ismail, for joining us. And I really want you to
pleasure to be with you again.
Really get into the meat of this, because it's really like winding me up. And every time I read about it and watch it on the news, it makes my blood boil. How these so-called freedom political figures who promote freedom and transparency and everything else, when it comes to the situation in Gaza, they just turn their backs. It's like it's nothing happening.
Indeed, it's the height of cynicism, and it is cynical. It's an exercise in cynicism. You mentioned a ceasefire, what they call a temporary truce. I mean, think what a temporary truce is. If somebody's in your house and he's busy engaging in armed robbery or robbery, what we would describe as robbery with aggravating circumstances, and he's just stabbed you, now you're bleeding. And in the process, he's basically taking out everything, all your assets, all your material goods, all your wealth. And then he says, look, he's going to have a bit of a truce, but that truce is about 10 minutes. So he'll give you 10 minutes to recover, go and have a glass of water, and then he'll come back again. That's basically what they're talking about, that when somebody is attacking you and he's just stabbed you, he's basically will give you about 5 or 10 minutes to go and have a cup of water, maybe some tea, if you can, in your bleeding state, and then he'll come back. That's what a truce. So why should Hamas, in fact, accept that truce? And why should they, in fact, accept the idea when Israel and indeed Netanyahu last week made it clear that whether the hostages are handed over or not, and whether you lay down, you basically decide to give them over and stop the hostilities at the very least, there will be an invasion of Rafah nonetheless. There's going to definitely be an invasion of Rafah. So from the perspective of Hamas, their argument is, well, why should they then accede to that? Because the general retort has been, at least in right-wing media sentiments, that it's Hamas that doesn't want a ceasefire, but they've asked for a ceasefire from day one. After the hostages were taken, they basically stated on the third or fourth day, we prepared to engage in a negotiated settlement on condition that those Palestinian prisoners and those Palestinian children that are languishing in Israeli dungeons essentially are basically transferred and released. So it's not actually, and Israel refused. So now the situation is, Israel has stated they want the hostages, but despite them getting the hostages back, they will persist with the invasion of Rafah. So it's got nothing to do with hostages in any event. Inevitably, when you carpet bomb an entire piece of land, the radius of which is approximately 60 kilometers, and you know full well you've got about 100 and somewhat hostages there, the inevitability is that they could also possibly die as a result of the carpet bombing. Further, you've on record killed 3 of your own hostages when they came with a white flag and they were half naked, coming to you, speaking in Hebrew. So why should anyone, any of the resistance organizations, in fact, trust you? And I think what's happening now, people out there are seeing this hypocrisy. And so this brings me back to the situation now in the United States, where there's been a kind of an explosion by students, similar to the protests that happened in '68, the civil protest movements that were basically generated by Martin Luther King Jr. and many others like Malcolm X and back then the Nation of Islam, or members within there, that you basically are seeing that at Columbia University, Harvard University, UCLA, that's University of California, Los Angeles, George Washington University, University of California, Berkeley. I mean, these are Ivy League universities, and it's difficult to get there. And a lot of the graduates from these universities end up becoming the leaders inevitably of society. They have high-ranking positions within the judiciary. They have high-ranking positions within the political establishment. So these are, in fact, the children of the elitists, because the average person, I mean, I just looked at the fees of some of these universities. They're exorbitant by South African standards at the very least. I'm not so sure what the position in the UK is, but by South African standards, these are exorbitant costs, resulting in a large number of these students being indebted for the rest of their lives. But the point is that these are the individuals, the so-called future leaders of society, that we've seen this kind of eruption from the 17th of April as part of a wider campaign stating that essentially these universities should divest. They should basically divest from any form of contact with Tel Aviv University. They should basically divest from any kind of financial ties that these universities may actually have with companies in Israel, as well as at the same time to end the general support for Israel, the U.S. military support, as part of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. You had a situation where New York University alumni from Palestine, they've called on New York University to terminate all vendor contracts with companies that are playing an active role in the military occupation of Palestine. You look at some of these companies, Cisco, Lockheed Martin, Caterpillar, General Electric. You find at the University of Washington, pro-Palestinian protesters have demanded that the University of Washington, in fact, cuts ties with Boeing. And one thing that we've seen in Fox News that I saw yesterday is that a lot of these particular protests are being viewed and being tainted and being stereotyped as being anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic protests. Now, I mean, the term itself, anti-Semitic, is so loaded. You could break that down in terms of who are Semites or who are not Semites, but let's leave it to anti-Jewish. The argument is that these are anti-Jewish protests, and that these protests are basically targeting Jewish people, and that they are hate protests calling for blood. This is rubbish. This is far from the truth. A lot of the protests in a lot of the universities are being actively participated and even organized by groups such as the Jewish Voice for Peace. The Jewish Voice for Peace, as an example, and the Students for Justice in Palestine, the If Not Now movement, these organizations are basically, by and large, dominated by Jewish individuals. I'll give you an example. The Jewish Voice for Peace, it's and what they call it in the Hebrew, the Kol Yehudi La Shalom, basically Jewish for Peace. It's a Zionist, an anti-Zionist advocacy organization that's been critical of Israel's occupation against the Palestinian territories since 1996. It was formed in 1996. It's registered as an advocacy organization. It was founded at the University of California, Berkeley. One of the executive directors, a noted Jewish individual, Stephanie Fox. You've got people like, members of this particular board include people like Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky. You've got someone by the name of Judith Butler. Judith Butler is the American philosopher and the gender studies scholar that's involved a lot in third wave discussions on third wave feminism and so on. The point is that these are Jewish organizations. So the Jewish Voice for Peace, it's a organization predominantly Jewish, led by Jewish participants and involving Jewish individuals that are calling out the state of Israel for severe human rights violations that Israel engages in daily. And they, of course, support the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And they've basically spoken out at length against what's happening in the West Bank, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the state of Israel in itself. And to suggest now that these marches are basically generating hatred of Jews is the furthest that you can get from the truth. If that was indeed the case, and that Jewish students are being victimized and being persecuted and being attacked and so on and so forth, then why is it that significant Jewish organizations are part and parcel of these protests that are basically being done and held in the United States since the beginning of April? I mean, just to give you an example, in terms of some of these universities that are basically being involved, I'll try and see if I can share the screen with you here. Let me go to my settings. No, the settings are fine. I think I go to present, share screen. And let me see if I can find out here the pro-Palestinian protests. Let me just see here. Yeah, here we are. Can you see the screen now, Brother Muhammad? These are the universities. These are the universities that are basically being involved. Look at the list of universities here. The Columbia University is marked in red. Other colleges that had encampments are marked in green, and non-encampment protests are marked in blue. So when we talk about encampment, we mean that they're actual, what you may call actual camps being set up on these particular universities, and they are, blatant in terms of their particular predominance at these specific universities entirely. So you can see essentially that reaching a crescendo, and people are basically fed up with what they see. People are dismayed, people are disgusted, and people are basically have had enough. And so this is what we've seen now over the past couple of months. And these protesters and these students are essentially calling for an end to the occupation, an end to the genocide, and essentially an end to what is basically happening in Gaza. This is basically what people want. They want this to end completely. And unfortunately, those particular protesters that are speaking out for peace, that are standing up for justice, that are standing up for the rights of the Palestinian people, they are being demonized. These are the individuals that are being demonized by Israel. I mean, look at some of these encampments here. Let's just look at some of these encampments that are basically happening. Look what you see here. This is the scenes of the reinstated Gaza Solidarity encampment at Columbia University and so forth. They reinstated because the police came and they broke this up. And look at the messages. These are messages, voices for peace. These are voices for peace. I mean, it's got nothing to do with hatred towards Jewish people. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's not a hate slogan. It's not a hate slogan. Divest, free Palestine, urgent. Calling for the people who are being basically persecuted and abused. UCLA students, we stand with our students. These are the the lecturers and the academic department that are basically standing up with the students in Gaza. This was, I think, at the Columbia University on April 23rd last week. So you can clearly see that's got nothing to do with hatred. It's got nothing to do with any kind of Jew hatred, any kind of anti-Semitism, nothing along that particular line. And what the reports basically seem to indicate, and in fact show, that these protests here, these protests that you are basically seeing, are in fact one of the largest protests since the Vietnam War. One of the largest protests since the Vietnam War. I mean, there's a Guardian report. This is a report in the Guardian that this basically what is perhaps the most significant student movement since the anti-Vietnam campus protests of the late 1960s. That's more than 50 years ago. We've never seen that. In fact, they report that the drone of helicopters over New York's Washington Square Park on Monday reviewed the arrival of the Strategic Response Group. And what the New York Police Department did is that they call counterterrorism and political protest divisions. And, the situation is you couldn't make it up. The actual act of violence that has been committed, has been committed not by the protesters. They've been committed by the actual NYPD, the New York Police Department, that have been behind this. You've got, for example, there's an interesting post, I think, if I can get to that, where essentially you had a situation at Emory University. I'm not so sure if you've seen this at Emory University, and let me see if I can, in fact, get that and share the particular screen with you. At Emory University recently, there was an assault that was perpetrated against not just the protesters, but also against academics. The New York, and it's beyond this, because the New York University Post, they've got an online YouTube channel, and this is what. Now, let me see if I can share this particular screen and expand it. This is something that we've got here, which happened at Emory University. I'm not so sure if you're familiar with this academic that was assaulted, but let me share the screen here, and let's see if I can get it here. This is the Emory University professor, and let's see what happened to her. Basically, let me get this. She stops police from assaulting anti-Israel protesters. They are beating up anti-Israel protesters. So look at what this cop does to this Emory University professor. I think she's the chair of the department. Here's the cop. He's grabbing her. He's grabbing her. Get on the ground. Abusing her. And look what he does to her. And then he puts his knee. And then there's another cop that comes and gets her. And he puts his knee on her. So this is the Emory University economics professor being wrestled to the ground. And this has become viral. And they've been assaulting people. Caroline Poland, that's her name. So you can essentially see what's going on there. I mean, these are individuals that are basically being assaulted, lecturers being assaulted, academics being assaulted, and then there was something which happened now. They've been accusing the Palestinian protesters of actually being involved in violent demonstrations, and there hasn't been a single violent demonstration being committed by Palestinians or Palestinian protesters, other than, of course, destruction of property. However, at UCLA, about I think on probably Monday or Tuesday, you had a situation, and let me share this, where Israeli counter-protesters, the Israeli counter-protesters basically engaged in acts of violence against the Palestinian encampments or the pro-Palestinian encampments that was set up at UCLA. And those people that are kicking and breaking down and throwing fireworks at the Palestinian protesters happen to be the pro-Israeli thugs. So these are Zionist Jewish Israeli thugs. Have a look at this. And this is wrong. This is from the Telegraph, but it's basically the Israeli thugs attacking. And look at the sign. I just want you to go back and look at the sign here. And you see the sign here? Look at the sign here. Jews for Palestine. So these are Jewish protesters protesting for Palestine being attacked by Israeli thugs and pro-Israeli demonstrators. This is what they've been doing. Attacking. They've been attacking this encampment. So the report is totally false by saying acts of violence. There's one side. These are pro-Israeli thugs. Pro-Israeli thugs attacking them. These are violent Jewish thugs. Look what they're doing. Look at these Israeli thugs that are engaged in this act. Supporters of Israel tried to clamp down a pro-Palestine encampment. People can be seen wielding sticks to attack makeshift barricades. And so these are being encouraged by the police. These are being encouraged by the NYPD. And can you see the guy beating up? That's an Israeli thug, pro-Israeli thug beating up Palestinians, pepper spraying Palestinians, throwing fireworks into Palestine, into the Palestinian protest encampment. So what you can see is that the violence has been happening, but the violence has basically come from one side, and it's only come from the Jewish side or from the police. It's only come from the Jewish side or from the police. This is another example here. I'll give you another example of these pro-Israeli thugs that are basically attacking the peaceful Palestinian encampment. So people need to know, those who are assuming that the violence are coming from Palestine. No, it's actually the other way around. Violence is coming from these pro-Israeli thugs. Again, so they're pulling out they're destroying these encampments. And then you see a situation where fireworks are thrown. Now, these people wielding sticks are the Israeli side, not the Palestinians. People wielding weapons.
The plywood is being put back up, but occasionally you see somebody try and either pull it.
You see that? Look at these fireworks.
Occasionally you see somebody try and either pull it down or kick it down. It just is escalating by the second.
And you see that's fireworks thrown into the Palestinian encampment, attacking women and children. Look at the guy there. These are white Israeli thugs. And university officials surrounded the camp. They never got involved. They never stopped the counter-protesters. So these are peaceful encampments by Jewish students, pro-Palestinian students, and then it's the counter-protesters that cause the violence. So that's from the Guardian. So what you can see is that when people are talking about hate, when people are talking about attacking, causing intimidation, and intimidating students, causing violence and all of that, well, who's causing the violence? The violence is being caused one side by the pro-Israeli side, by the pro-Israeli thugs that are there on the scene for example, at UCLA. The pro-Israeli group attacked the pro-Palestinian protesters camp. They breached the barricades, as you can clearly see, surrounding the encampment. And these attackers, in fact, came from outside of the campus, meaning they were not students, because it's been generally alleged that the pro-Palestinian protests are not students. Well, a lot of them are students. There may be one or two that are not, but the pro-Israeli side attackers came from outside the campus. They carried Israeli flags. They assaulted students with sticks, with stones, with metal poles, with metal fencing, with pepper spray. They then threw fireworks into the pro-Palestinian encampment. And there's one scene, I need to just find that video, where they play a loud audio of a child crying, which is a Palestinian crying, out of mockery. They throw wood and a metal barrier into the camp, and they shot fireworks into the encampment. Then, besides that, what they were calling for, which is quite strange, they said Nakba, 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 calling for a second Nakba. The pro-Israeli side were calling and shouting out Nakba against the Palestinians. Let me see if I can find that particular video. And then afterwards, they then attack the Palestinians entirely in the encampment. So there's been violence that we have seen at these protests, but the violence has basically come from two quarters, not from the pro-Palestinian side. It's been coming from the pro-Israeli side and from the police. In New York University, it was the NYPD that was behaving like a bunch of thugs. US police attacking pro-Palestinian protesters, beating them up. Let me see if I can get a video showing that in more clearer video footage on that particular way. There's live view here. And these are the police. These are the police basically attacking. Let's see what we happen here. We are here. Let me see if I can open this up here. This is one video. I'm not sure. I think they dismantled the actual encampment. Let me see if I can show the screen. We are here. Yeah, we are here. Present screen. Share screen. I think this is one of it. Yeah.
Is tossing the concern.
That's police. That's police gunfire you're hearing. And then there's rubber bullets being flowed. Rubber bullets. These are rubber bullets being shot at protesters.
For a week, pro-Palestinian protesters occupied this part of the university campus. One of the grandest buildings in one of America's most prestigious universities. This is what it looks like now.
So there's no signs of hate anywhere. No signs of hate.
The resolve of these protesters is now being seriously tested. Those at the front of this barricade are calling for helmets and shields as they try to stem the advance of the police.
The police had already tried once to break up the protests. For many students, this is about much more than Gaza. It's about policing too.
Police officers have just let off a flashbang device. It's used to distract these protesters as they prepare to move in and dismantle this encampment.
But seemingly overwhelmed by protesters' resistance, they retreated. Celebrations, though, were short-lived. More explosions overhead. Police hacking down the fence guarding the encampment. Chemical spray was fired towards them.
This is absolutely ridiculous.
Then protesters picked off one by one. Rubber bullets were deployed too. At least one man requiring hospital treatment. The force used by police will be closely scrutinised. His people divided. A president.
So that's basically what you have in terms of what's going on the campuses. And I mean, you know, the evidence is so clear, and yet the side that is basically calling for peace, calling for justice, and calling for desisting of the genocide that's going on, they are the ones that are being viewed as hate mongers. They are the ones that are being painted as violent. It's like, as Orwell says, an inversion of reality. The opposite. It's the opposite of the reality of what's basically going on. And I think basically people are being fed up. It's people power. You know, it's the civil disobedience in the face of tyranny and oppression. And that's basically what the students are doing. And we need to support them. We need to basically give them our, salute in terms of what they're doing. And these protests should basically spread in different parts of the universities in different parts of the world. There was an issue that was made on I think it was on Fox News and on I think mainly Fox News and then on CNN about the fact that what about the destruction that is caused as a result of these particular protests, and what do people say about this, and how do they justify, how do they explain this? And this has been raised. Now there's been some windows that have been damaged. There's been one hall that's been taken over, the Hamilton Hall, I think in one of the universities at Columbia, which has been renamed the Hind Hall, after Hind Rajab, the baby that was murdered by Israeli soldiers. But the main concern is, well, look, how can you destroy university infrastructure? That's the main point. Some infrastructure, and certainly there may be windows that may have been broken, and there may have been graffiti that has been sprayed about free Gaza, free Palestine. That's the worst that you can do. But what do they say about this? They're talking about few damages to broken windows and window panes that could be destroyed, and but generally the university is up and running and exams are going on and so on, but there's been some sort of disruptions. What do they say, on the other hand, to this? You're speaking about the universities there. What about the fact that in Gaza now, there's not a single university? Every single university has been totally destroyed. As of April 18th, this is a UN report. You can see this on the screen. This is a UN report over the scholasticide. What they've described is a scholasticide in Gaza. United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. As of 18th April, grave concern over the pattern of attacks on schools, universities, teachers, students, raising serious alarm over the systematic destruction of the Palestinian education system. Back then, 80% of schools in Gaza damaged or destroyed. It may be reasonable to ask if there is an intentional effort to comprehensively destroy the Palestinian education system. As of April 18th, it stated here that after 6 months of assault, more than 5,479 students, 261 teachers, 95 university professors have been killed, and over 7,819 students and 756 teachers have been injured, with numbers growing each day. And as of 18th April, we now on the 5th of May, about 195 heritage sites, 227 mosques, 3 churches have been destroyed, and the central archives of Gaza, including 550 years of history, have been totally destroyed. Isra University, the last remaining university in Gaza, was demolished by the Israeli military on the 17th of January 2024. Without safe schools, women and girls face additional risk, including gender-based violence. More than 1 million Palestinian children in Gaza are now in need of mental health and psychosocial support. So isn't it ironic that these hypocrites out there are talking about possibly some sort of graffiti that has been painted by the Palestinians? This is my son, by the way, by the Palestinian protesters, and indeed by some destruction of window panes and windows and so on. but how do they explain the fact that approximately every single university, I wouldn't say approximately, but every single university in Gaza has been totally destroyed, totally demolished. The academic department totally destroyed. The university academic staff totally destroyed. The students, 5,479 active students murdered. About 7,819 students, or together with 756 teachers, injured. What do we explain? How do we justify this? You can't make the inversion of reality again and again, that the reality of the situation is the complete opposite. You're concerned about education and universities and the right of academic stuff. What about the fact that halfway around the world, you've allowed, systematically and actively supported a illegitimate Nazi-like regime, the Israeli government, which has destroyed the entire educational infrastructure and academic system in Gaza? Talk about that. That's a hypocrisy of what you see in reality in terms of what's happening. So I just wanted to share that point in relation to the university protests. Over to you, Brother Mohammed.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, the events that are taking place around the world. It's not just in America, it's in Australia, in the UK, some parts of Europe also have got these protests in universities and colleges. I really want to touch on the aspect of what the United Nations is actually saying right now. In the north of Gaza, they are actually openly saying the World Food Program, the WFP, are saying right now that there is a full-blown famine taking place right now in the northern part of Gaza. And that can quickly spread across all aspects and areas of Gaza due to the lack of aid that is being brought into Gaza. And what you mentioned there regarding the truce, and I'm going to link this to the aid situation. The aid is just like a few handfuls of food and water and medicines, but it's nothing compared to how it used to be. Meaning the trucks. I think it was hundreds of trucks entering Gaza. Now maybe 25, 30 trucks are getting into Gaza. And I want to get your thoughts on this full-blown famine statement, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I'll just share that in terms of what's happening now. This is, and I'm going to try and look at Western media. This is CNN. So out there, remember CNN, basically the article written by Kathleen Magramo. She speaks about a full-blown famine happening in Gaza. The World Food Program warns amid fresh push for truce. And the report basically states, this is, I think, this post is 24 hours ago. These are Palestinian children that are receiving cooking meals at Deir el-Bala on the 1st of May. But what the report goes is that there is a full-blown famine of, I had a picture on a video on WhatsApp of a boy with full-blown kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor is where the stomach bloats. And those are images that you essentially saw in places like Rwanda and in Ethiopia and Somalia in the 80s. But you never saw that in Gaza. You saw hunger, you saw desperation, you saw persecution, but you never saw something on that scale, And inevitably, what you have is a situation is that in places like Somalia and Ethiopia, where there was famine, where there was drought, and so on, a lot of it was caused through the limited resources. Of course, they had resources, but the accumulation of resources by a select few. Of course, you may have had a situation of war, but that had built up over a number of years. In Gaza, what you've got now is the kind of full-blown famine that you've seen in places like Ethiopia and Somalia and indeed in Rwanda in the 90s, but something that has happened in such a quick scale, in the scale of approximately 4 to 5 months. And so the report is, the executive director, Cindy McCain, told Meet the Press, she says, it's a horror, she said, of the situation in Gaza. It's so hard to look at, and it's so hard to hear. And she's also called for ceasefire and unfettered access to Gaza. It has been extremely difficult. And of course, the pressure has been after the strikes deliberately killed those 7 staffers of the World Central Kitchen. But basically what's happened is that human rights agencies, since the beginning of October, have warned about this humanitarian crisis that has basically been happening in Gaza, warned deliberately of the fact that these civilians, and these are figures being given by the Israelis themselves, by the Gaza Health Ministry, and confirmed by the Israelis in relation to this. 36,400. I think the figures are in fact even more than that. They're close to 40,000 at this particular juncture. So this is a reality of the situation, Brother Muhammad. The reality is that we are facing untold, full-blown famine, full-blown genocide, full-blown mass murder, full-blown war crimes, and people have the audacity to basically go and say that, look, this is essentially, Israel does not deliberately target civilians. I mean, what are they talking about? I see these debates still happening, even on some of these YouTube channels. Israel does not deliberately target civilians. Well, I mean, they're targeting them. We're seeing it before our very eyes. How do you deal with people that are out there to deny the reality of what's going on? People questioning whether there's a genocide taking place. Genocide is before our very eyes. I mean, what more needs to be done for there to be a proof that a genocide is happening? I mean, there's an article here. This is a reporter which I'll share with you. He's a professor of Holocaust and genocide studies, a Jewish individual by the name of Rez Siegel. He's a professor for the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. And way back on the 7th of October, he already stated that Israel's attack post the 7th of October was a textbook case of genocide in relation to what is basically happening. I mean, here's the article here, a textbook case of genocide. Where we are, here's it here, a textbook case of genocide. This is on October 13 by Rez Siegel, a professor of genocide studies, writing in a news magazine, a Jewish news magazine called Jewish Currents. So these are not pro-Palestinian, anti-Jewish organizations. This is Rez Siegel on the October 7th, 13th, by the way, a couple of days later. And he already called it out. He says, Israel's campaign to displace Gazans and potentially expel them into Egypt. They've already expelled them to the south. The assault in Gaza can also be understood in other terms as a textbook case of genocide unfolding in front of our eyes. I say this as a scholar of genocide who has spent many years writing about Israeli mass violence against Palestinians. I've written about settler colonialism and Jewish supremacy in Israel, the distortion of the Holocaust to boost the Israeli arms industry, the weaponization of anti-Semitism, accusations to justify Israeli violence, and the racist regime of Israeli apartheid. Now, following Hamas's attack on Saturday and the mass murder, the worst of the worst is still happening. And then he goes on to state that under international law, the crime of genocide, and he breaks down what genocide is, what is happening, the various steps, the 5 acts that fulfilled under the UN Genocide Convention. And back then on October 13th, we're talking about October 13th, not May 5th, October 13th, the Israeli force, by its own account, has dropped more than 6,000 bombs on Gaza. More than 6,000 bombs. And Human Rights Watch has confirmed that the weapons used include phosphorus bombs, which set fire to bodies and buildings, creating flames that aren't extinguished on contact with water. Now, I'll tell you something. I'm a criminal lawyer. And in some of our communities, and I work in the rural community, you see murder being perpetrated. And in many instances, we still have witch killings. Can you believe that? Witch killings, where in the rural community, there are allegations that certain women are witches. and the mob community comes and they burn them alive. I mean, unbelievable. But in South Africa, it's common where people are burnt alive as witches. And I've seen the after effects, looking at the pictures and the post-mortem reports about what's basically happening and how these particular individuals are being murdered in this brutal fashion. This fat is removed, the skin is basically peeled off, they darken. It's like a true horror. But the flames are basically extinguished as a result of the the water or whatever extinguishing that they are basically used. With phosphorus bombs, with white phosphorus bombs, you can't essentially, this is white phosphorus, you can't you basically extinguish it as a result of water. And here's an example where Israel's clearly used white phosphorus in Gaza. They've used it in Lebanon. They've used it on the 10th and the 11th of October. These are artilleries. Can you see the pictures? Because they've denied it. Airbursts of artillery fired white phosphorus fall over Gaza city port on October 11th. This is a war crime. This is a total war crime. The incendiary weapons that are basically being used. On October 11th, Human Rights Watch interviewed by phone 2 people from the Almina area. We're talking about October 11th, who described observing strikes consistent with the use of white phosphorus. One was in the street at the time, while the other was in a near office building. Both said the smell was stifling. They estimated that the attack took place sometime between 11:30 and 1 p.m. And Human Rights Watch reviewed the videos from October 7th and basically confirmed that white phosphorus was in fact used. What white phosphorus does is that it ignites the atmosphere. It ignites the atmosphere, it burns the atmosphere. And as a result of that, basically, people who are in contact with that essentially burn. And you can't basically, so it creates this chemical reaction. And the chemical reaction is totally destructive. So you look at some of these survivors. Some of the survivors, the muscle tightens, there's scarring, there's physical disabilities, there's trauma perpetually. And why would you do that if your aim is basically to target and attack Hamas? Why would you then use that on civilians? Why? Well, why would you use that against civilian infrastructure and against people, knowing full well that this has been used? And I mean, this has been done in 2009, in 2012, in 2014. Even though they claimed in response to a petition to Israel's High Court of Justice relating to the usage of white phosphorus, the Israeli military stated it wouldn't use white phosphorus. The point is that they're still using it today. They're still using it today. And these are prohibited weapons under the Protocol 3 of the Convention on the Usage of Conventional Weapons. So if that is being used, and if Human Rights Watch documents that, and if the protocols have been published and have prohibited this a long, long time ago, why then is both the Labour and the Conservative government still giving its moral support to Israel? It doesn't make any kind of sense whatsoever. No sense whatsoever in relation to the situation in terms of what's happening. So this is the reality of the situation. Even if you're assuming you're acting on self-defense, even if people are making the kind of proportionality argument, which is totally ludicrous, you can't even make a proportionality argument when you're using a weapon that is a weapon of mass destruction on civilian population. You can't in any way make that particular argument that there's some sort of defense that is being used in relation to that. So this is the problem that we've got pertaining to what's happening, and I think there's no justification in relation to what's happening. And again, people are speaking out against calling this a genocide or saying that there's no genocide taking place. Well, here is a public statement by scholars. These are the statements of scholars. This is again on the 15th of October 2023. There were 800 scholars and practitioners of international law, conflict studies, and genocide studies signed a public statement back then, 15th of October, warning of the possibility of genocide being perpetrated by the Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. What's the date? 15th of October, 2023. Long before the South African application to the ICJ. It was the National Lawyers Guild, the Russell Tribunal of Palestine, the Center for Constitutional Rights. All of this have called out Israel in the past. But these are the list of signatories to this public statement warning Israel of its particular aims in genocide. Look at the number of academics. Look at the academics. Jewish academics, genocide studies academics, political science academics, from all the major Ivy League universities throughout the world. From all the major, and there's a total of 800 professors of all the major universities in the world. Just to give you an example, international human rights lawyer, Robert Kennedy Human Rights, SOAS, University of London, all the major organizers, all the major institutions, academic institutions have called this out. So there are people out there who are now in the media and indeed on YouTube, stupid YouTubers, stupid individuals that are wanting to make a quick algorithm, becoming an algorithm prostitute and just increase their viewings and so on, that are questioning this, and silly channels like Talk TV and so on questioning this, when you've got studies, scholars and students and individuals on genocide who study genocide, who know what genocide is all about, are calling this out and holding Israel accountable. And this was way back. Look at the date. This is way back in on the 15th of October. Have a look at this. A Third World Approaches to International Law Review, an academic journal, calling this out as early as the 15th of October 2023, about 8 days after October 7th. So there's the other side. The other side has lost total morality. Whoever you are, you've lost morality, you've lost your argument, you've lost your moral grounds in relation to what is happening. Hence, as a result of that, and as a result of what people are seeing, it's now becoming apparent that the news media, knowing the implications of this, are even scared to share what people and academics have been basically stating. So, for example, there was the Intercept article. The Intercept article a couple of days ago, which dealt with the leaked New York Times memo. And it basically gave an instruction, a memo by the editorial committee of the New York Times. And this memo basically told the journalists working at the New York Times, avoid using terms like genocide, avoid using terms like ethnic cleansing, avoid using terms like occupied territory. So the New York Times has instructed journalists covering Israel's war. It's restricting the terms of genocide, ethnic cleansing. The memo also instructs reporters not to use the word Palestine, except in very rare cases, and to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by displaced Palestinians expelled from other parts of Palestine during the previous Israeli-Arab wars. And these areas are recognized by the United Nations as refugee camps, and the United Nations headquarters is in New York City, and yet the New York Times is instructing journalists. The memo, written by the Times Standards editor, Susan Westling, and the deputies, offers guidance about some terms and other issues which we have grappled with since the start of the conflict in October. What are they grappled with? What's there to grapple about? So this is an article in the Intercept. I'll send you all the links, Brother Mohammed. I know in the past there's been difficulty putting up the links, but once the stream is finished, we'll send these journal articles as links and people can click on them and then, of course, read these articles for themselves. Here's the thing. While the document is presented as an outline for maintaining objective journalistic principles, several Times staffers told The Intercept that some of its contents show evidence of the paper's deference to Israeli narratives. And they say, I think it's a kind of thing that looks professional and logical if you have no knowledge of the historical context, said a Times newsroom's reporter. But if you know, it will be clear how apologetic it is to Israel. So this is a situation in terms of what is going on in relation to what's happening in Gaza and in terms of what's transpiring.
I would like to touch
Genocide is
on.
clearly unfolding. People are shutting journalists and individuals that are basically speaking out and calling them out for this.
Yeah, I really want to touch on this particular truce or ceasefire conditions. The Israeli army are still saying, and the political bodies of Israel are still saying that they will still continue and plan to raid Rafah, even if a ceasefire or a truce has been agreed. What's your take on that? The aspects of Rafah is very complex. I think it will be a slaughter. I think it'll be horrendous if that actually goes ahead. I think this particular individual, BN, I don't like even using his full name, BN, the Prime Minister or the
Netanyahu, the thug.
The thug. I think he is depending that this war continues because he is up for some particular criminal charges against him. So as long as he is inside the government, he's like untouchable. I actually feel, and I'd love to have your thoughts on this, that he wants this war to prolong for his own personal career. What's your take on that, Brother Ismail?
Well, Netanyahu has basically stated that they will proceed to invade Rafah without. No, they haven't done it. I mean, they have basically attacked Rafah, and you've seen the attacks and the strikes that are basically going on. But they made it clear that with or without a deal, they're basically going to go ahead and attack Rafah. But what is more remarkable is that the International Court of Justice at this particular juncture has issued an arrest warrant. They haven't issued an arrest warrant. They've threatened that I think the prosecutor at the ICC, and he's been very slow. His name is Karim. He's threatened that they will basically, if Israel persists with this, and I don't know what they mean by persist, that there will be an arrest warrant looming. The guy's name is Karim Khan. He basically stated that if Israel persists with its conduct, they will have no hesitation of issuing arrest warrants. And then what then happened is that the Israeli government, via Netanyahu, in a statement that was made a couple of days ago, they threatened to retaliate against the court. Obviously not physical, but threats of retaliation against it and to attack its credibility if it proceeded with the arrest warrants. The prosecutor has since hit back and has issued a denunciation and claimed that essentially what Israel is intending to do is undermine the independence and the impartiality of this particular court. Because when you are issuing threats against the International Criminal Court, then that in itself constitutes an offense under the Rome Statute, because the ICC is basically being told and being intimidated not to proceed, and Netanyahu is basically demanding that they essentially there will be consequences for the ICC if it proceeds with its arrest warrant. I'm not so sure why they have waited for such a long time, because the problem why the American government is supporting the Israeli regime on this particular issue is that they are concerned that if the ICC issues an arrest warrant against Netanyahu and the thugs like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir and all the right-wing fascists in the Israeli Knesset, and there may be a situation where eventually they will have a situation that American political leaders, American diplomats, American military personnel that have been involved in war crimes over the past decades, they could easily issue arrest warrants where individuals can then, because the ICC allows individuals to approach the ICC to lay criminal complaints against politicians and political parties, unlike the ICJ. And so their concern is that if they issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his gang of thugs, then that will essentially basically set a precedent whereby possibly American officials would be issued with arrest warrants for crimes that they have basically committed. And what has happened is that just last week, the Israeli government stated that it would then retaliate against the Palestinian Authority that has not been part of this conflict if the ICC issues arrest warrants for the Israeli leaders. So this is a kind of threat that you see being issued by the Israeli government. And what the US stance has been, the United States government, the Biden administration, has been exposed for the hypocrisy, because last year they gave a vocal support for the ICC's decision to issue arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin over the war crimes it allegedly committed in Ukraine, even though neither Russia nor Ukraine are parties to the Rome Statute, which was established by the ICC. And to my understanding, I think the State of Israel is a party to the Rome Statute. In fact, the Genocide Convention and all of that was created. That was the ICC was created in 1990, in the 1990s. But the ICJ was post 48 under the World Court, and the Genocide Convention comes from there. And so there's a kind of a link between the parties. But the problem is that you have a situation where the ICC has issued an arrest warrant against Putin, who is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, for far less than what Netanyahu and his thugs have done. I mean, to give you an example, the Ukraine war began in 2022, somewhere around there. I think, was it January 2022? About 2 years. December 2022. Around about January 2022, I can't even recall the date. It was such a long time ago. It's been going on for about 2 or 3 years. The number of children killed in that war, about a month ago, I looked at the stats. It was 200. 200 kids killed. 200. In 6 months in Gaza, you had 25,000 women and children alone killed, up to 15,000 children. So look at the scale of the magnanimity and the scale of the carnage that we see in Israel and Gaza, as opposed to what you see in Ukraine. And yet they've issued arrest warrants for Ukraine. And all that the ICC has done is threaten that it may issue arrest warrants against Israel. Hasn't issued, just threatened. And as a result of the threat, it has come under attack by the State of Israel, by the regime out there, by these particular individuals. And so what you have is a situation in terms of which, once again, we see the cynicism of global power, in terms of how the powerful basically are kept at bay. This is the article in the Guardian on the I'm just trying to see the date. This was on the 29th of April, which would mean it would have been Monday last week. If I can just see the Guardian article. What will happen if Netanyahu, if the ICC charges Netanyahu with war crimes? Because that's what you do. You charge them with war crimes. Israeli government, the international court is about to file criminal. We can't know for sure. The ICC chief prosecutor Karim Khan, I don't know the background of this guy here, most likely targets Netanyahu's starvation strategy for Palestinian civilians. So it's a starvation. Because the Israeli government has refused to let the ICC staff into Gaza, it will take time for Khan to complete the detailed investigation required to demonstrate other possible Israeli war crimes, such as the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and firing on military targets with disproportionate civilian consequences. They still have to look into that. So the point is that they are slow in terms of what is happening, very slow. And despite them being slow, Israel has still issued a threat against them that it will take strong actions against the ICC and, of course, undermine the credibility of the ICC if it proceeds in relation to this. But this is a situation that we have. I don't know why the prosecutor takes his threats with a pinch of salt and has just made public pronouncements, but has done nothing. I mean, there's more than ample evidence, that war crimes has in fact been committed. More than ample evidence. that war crimes has been committed. And this is a situation that you basically have in terms of what we see.
Well said. My final take on it, and you mentioned it prior to this particular topic that I raised, that I do feel that we are being programmed by the media and by our political leaders, and kind of being numbed when we see the death toll in Palestine, or images of the Palestinians and the situation in Gaza, that we kind of get numbed to it, meaning the sense that we don't feel that sorrow anymore, or we don't feel that empathy anymore, we don't feel that concern anymore. But when it comes to the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and amount of billions of pounds and euros and dollars that are being sent for the Ukrainian to purchase or military supplies, we are kind of like made more aware how bad Russia is. But I do feel, Brother Yusuf, here in the UK especially, that our political leaders are kind of like making us feel, or making us forget also, the crimes that are being committed. And
I think it's called social science calls it psychic numbing. It's like a psychological phenomenon that causes us to feel indifferent to the suffering of large numbers of people. Because for what happens for a lot of people is that these are just numbers on the screen. And, what it does is that psychic numbing, in fact, limits the human compassion when confronted with mass atrocities and widespread suffering. In other words, we become insensitive. The numbers are so large, and this limits our capacity to take action, that we just basically become numb to what is happening. And so what programs like ours and yours do is that we promote the kind of dialogue and cultural exchange. And indeed, we personalize the story. It's, the one thing that Israeli propagandists did with October 7th, besides the atrocity propaganda and the lies that they spread, is that they personalized stories, even though they were fake stories. But when you personalize individual stories, like, for example, the murder of Hind Rajab, or, for example, the mass murder that's been killed at the Jabalia refugee camp, or individuals with names and details and histories and so on, once you personalize that, then they become more than just simply statistics. So you highlight the human aspect of a crisis, it can become far more relatable and emotionally impactful. That's what they did with Ukraine. The West did that with Ukraine. And when it comes to the Palestinians, they don't engage in that. And so basically Western media limits, and psychic numbing is something when people are culturally removed from the context of a slaughter. So you call it a tragedy. When you call something a tragedy and people are dying, it's like a natural disaster. It's not a tragedy. What's happening in Gaza is not a tragedy. A tragedy is where people die in a flood, where people die through natural disaster, an earthquake. That's a tragedy, or a car accident. This is not a tragedy. This is evil, mass murder. It's not a tragedy. So they don't see Palestinians as humans, and they don't want the world to know Palestinians as humans, and therefore they don't have a connection to them. So I see on these news stations, when people talk about 40,000 Palestinians being slaughtered, I hear Mustafa Barghouti and many other candidates on Western news outlets mention this. It just becomes a number. And then they say, then what's the response to that? This is the inevitability of war. This is collateral damage. That's the kind of rubbish that you are being responded to by these anchors in the mainstream media. I think I may have mentioned this. I don't want to give them too much of coverage, but I wanted to actually go on a program where this is so common, but it's like a Laurel and Hardy comedian show by these two clowns who I never heard of before October 7th or before the Gaza. Chaps known as James, Whale, and Ash. Do you know them? They run some clown show, but they regularly talk about the Palestinian conflict, and you hear the same rubbish being dished out by them. This is war, the inevitability of war. It's always tragic. It's not tragic. Tragedy is when people die in a storm, they die in a flood, there's a natural disaster, there's an earthquake, there's an accident, there's a car accident, people have fallen down, people tragically die of a heart attack. That's a tragedy. This is not a tragedy. This is not a tragedy. This is plain down evil, satanic evil being committed by the last remaining satanic colonial white settler state that exists in the world, the state of Israel, the last apartheid state. So the question is, does Israel have a right to exist? The answer is no. Firstly, no state has a right to exist. People have a right to exist, not state. And I state this boldly. Israel has no right to exist. Challenge me on that, because it was bombed into existence illegally. It sustained itself through genocide and colonial settler occupation. And it exists today as an apartheid state. So an apartheid state doesn't have a right to exist. So when people ask you the question, surely Israel has a right to exist? No, it does not have the right to exist. Did apartheid South Africa have a right to exist? The answer is no. So similarly, apartheid Israel has no right to exist. Be bold and say that. Don't yield and acquiescence to this kind of propaganda where you've been confronted with these challenges. Is Hamas a terrorist organization? Well, Martin Griffiths from the United Nations clearly states Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It may have engaged in acts which led to the killing of civilians on October 7th, but Israel, in fact, killed civilians on October 7th, deliberately invoking the Hannibal Directive. So let me just share this article here with you here. This was Martin Griffiths as an example to this kind of regular talking point that was being raised by people, where people were being questioned, is Hamas a terrorist organization, or will it be, can you condemn it? For some reason, the post doesn't seem to open here, but I'm just see if I can get this. I'll send the link where Martin Griffiths essentially says that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It's a political movement. It was formed, was democratically elected. He's a general for the humanitarian affairs, Martin Griffiths. For some reason, the post can't seem to open. I think my Wi-Fi is going down for some bizarre reason. But this is the reality of the situation. So this is what we need to do. Speak out, create the dialogue, and move away from this psychotic numbing that war seems to have been done. Personalize the crisis of individuals. This is a reality. And when we do that, that's when people will wake up. And that's what's happening in the United States campuses, where people are standing up now and challenging the status quo of their own establishment, because the Columbia University academic establishment clamped down on their own students. People need to stand up. And I give my full salute to the students at the universities in the United States and indeed in other parts of the world, where they're creating this awareness against this rapacious, evil, genocidal, apartheid Israeli regime.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, brother. Fantastic. Really, really appreciate that information. MashaAllah. I think we need to continue raising awareness. And I don't care even if we get one person watching the stream or nobody watching the stream. This will be recorded and is part of history that we are witnessing right now. History is taking place, and it depends which side you're on, to be honest. And I really want to continue with this because myself, I'm being clear which side I'm on, and we all have to stand up, and we are going to be counted. So at the end of the day, I don't care if there's one person watching or hundreds watching. I really want to put this message out with our brother Yusuf that justice has to be served, and the crimes that are being committed against the brothers and sisters in Palestine have to be. I'm trying to figure out the right kind of terminology to use. The crime has to be punished. It has to be punished either in this life or the next life. I know that ICJ, isn't it, brother Yusuf? You know, they seem to be dragging their feet. When it came, like you mentioned, the Ukraine situation, they were very quick to put sanctions and send out arrest warrants for Putin and so forth. But when it comes to the Israeli situation, this seems to be dragging their feet to sending arrest warrants and whatnot to these so-called.
But I think people
leaders.
need to know this one point on the ICJ, and it'll take its time for deliberation. But the one thing is, and people need to know, because I see false information on this, that the ICJ that has determined that Israel's actions in Gaza are plausibly genocidal. And so they did indicate provisional measures for that basis. I was not too happy with that judgment and the dragging out, but the pro-Israeli propagandists want to make the point that they made a ruling that there was no genocide. No, they didn't make that ruling that there was no genocide. They stated that South Africa, my government, had made out a plausible case that Israel is indeed committing genocide. It's like if somebody is being charged for murder, he then goes on trial for murder. And based on the fact that the state has what we would call a prima facie case, or in your country, you don't call it the state, you call it the crown, has a prima facie case of murder against the individual. That's what the ICJ ruled, that they have a prima facie case, and that a prima facie case has been made out that Israel may be committing genocide and that its actions are plausibly genocidal. That's what the interim ruling by the ICJ was. And they were then notified that the United Nations Security Council was, subsequent to the ruling, notified of the court's order pursuant to one of the articles of the court statute in relation to that. And so from the ICJ's perspective, there's a plausible case for genocide, and Israel at this stage is now a country on trial for genocide. So whatever the outcome of the ICJ in the future is, and I have my doubts on these international judicial bodies, whatever the outcome is, Israel's reputation will now forever be tainted, like Nazi Germany's reputation has been tainted with the charge of genocide against it. Whatever you say, 50 years, 60 years, 100 years from now, the world will know that Israel was on trial for genocide, just like Yugoslavia was, the Serbs was. And it's not actually the number, because people make the false argument that, well, if there was a genocide, why is it that Israel would have wiped out the whole population? That's a bad argument, because if you look at Srebrenica, where the Bosnian Muslims were murdered, only 5,000 Muslims were murdered. But the World Court held back then, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia held, that there was, in fact, a genocide that had been committed, even though there were only 5,000 people that were killed. So those who make the argument that, well, if there was a genocide, it would be the entire population of Gaza, it's rubbish. You don't know the law. All you need for genocide is the intent of dolus specialis, which has been clearly proven from day one, the genocidal statements and rhetoric made by the Israeli officials, members of the Israeli Knesset, members of the leading Israeli elite in the Israeli society, and juxtaposing that with what's been happening on the ground, clearly the existence of genocidal acts being committed by Israel. We discussed on the your last podcast about the AI technology which is being used, where the AI targets the families of certain Hamas suspects. And of course, there's numerous case studies where there's deliberate, intentional targeting of civilians. You can't make that up in any given way, shape, or form. The reality, in fact, stares us straight in the face. So that's what I wanted to share at this juncture on this particular point.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Brother Yusuf. Really appreciate your, mashallah, your input. I really, really do. And I just want to finally mention that hopefully myself, I'll be driving up to Speaker's Corner shortly.
I wish you well this afternoon, inshallah.
Inshallah, jazakallah khair. So, brothers and sisters, thank you once again for joining us early morning Sunday here in the UK. And I think South Africa, I think you're 1 hour in front of us. So if it's 10:30 a.m. here, it's
exactly 11:30 here. Exactly 11:30. So we are an hour ahead of you.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Fantastic, Brother Yusuf. Once again, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know it was short notice, but nevertheless, we made it happen, alhamdulillah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hopefully, maybe after a week or so, we can arrange another discussion.
Sure.
And we can talk, and maybe a possible ceasefire maybe has been implemented. I just hope and pray that something, a long-lasting ceasefire, or to be honest, the end to this war has to be not far away now, because it's getting bad. It really, well, it's not getting bad. It's bad, and we need to really speak up about it and express our thoughts and feelings about this situation in Gaza. Thank you, Brother Yusuf. Final words to you before I end the show.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be on your program, to be with you. I really appreciate your time, and I urge people and members out there to support your channel and subscribe to our channel. It's a small fledgling channel that was created about a year ago, the South African Debate Initiative, where we upload material similar to this, and this will be going up on our channel itself. So you just simply type in the South African Debate Initiative. You'll find our YouTube channel, subscribe to it, and you'll have regular content. And subscribe to Brother Muhammad's channel, Kov FF channel, and to keep in touch and updated with some of the latest discussions that he has. So wishing all members out there, Muslim, non-Muslim, greetings of peace, and speak out, stand up, and speak out against the Israeli genocide and make people aware of what's happening.
Thank you. Barakallah feekum. To
Barakallah.
everybody,
Assalamu alaikum.
and wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.